Hey, Soundside, it is Wednesday of Passion Week, and this week we have been trying to just remind ourselves of what Jesus went through on his way to Good Friday. Of course, on Good Friday, Jesus was crucified in the place of us for our sins, that we might be forgiven. But there was more that went on that week. It's what we've been looking at this week. Rather than going chronologically through the week or through the events of Passion Week, we've been looking at several elements of what Christ endured in our place on his way to the cross. On Monday, we looked at how Jesus endured betrayal at the hands of a disciple, a friend. And then yesterday, we looked at how Jesus endured denial, where a friend became a complete stranger. Today we're going to talk about one other thing that Jesus endured in our place, and that thing is injustice. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced injustice. I'm certain that most of us have felt at some point in time that we've not been treated fairly. But I want you to know, as we consider what happened to Jesus that last week of his life prior to his resurrection, he endured injustice on a total scale. We saw already how he was arrested in the middle of the night, betrayed by Judas, and taken over to the high priest's house where he would be tried. The problem is they needed something to accuse him of. And so they put out a call to anybody who was willing to accuse Jesus in court of some kind of crime that they could use to condemn him. The problem was, as the witnesses came forward, none of their testimonies agreed. All the false witnesses came and tried to accuse him of one thing versus another, and every time they did, their testimony fell apart. Until finally somebody came forward and said, you know what, we heard this guy say that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And they were looking for a second witness to corroborate that testimony. And they found somebody, but he stepped forward to give that testimony, and it didn't quite agree with the first one. And finally, the high priest was just fed up with it and stepped forward and looked at Jesus and said, come on, you hear all the things they're accusing you of. What do you have to say? Are you the Son of God or not? And Jesus said, I am. And at that point, the high priest tore his robes and looked at the gathered guests there in the courtroom and said, we don't have need for testimony. You've all heard it. This man has blasphemed. He is worthy of death. Well, certainly in their laws, blasphemy was in fact punishable by death, but Jesus hadn't committed blasphemy. Jesus hadn't committed any crime that they could reasonably accuse him of, and the one crime that they thought he had committed, he hadn't, because he was in fact the Son of God. Well, the chief priests and the Jewish leaders took Jesus early in the morning, before the sun was up even, and took them over to the Roman governor's house. You see, they wanted Jesus to suffer the worst kind of punishment that he could. Not just a punishment at their hands, so that he might become a martyr and they might become the villains. No. He had to be crucified in the most despicable way possible, hung on a cross, bearing the curse of God, so that no one after his death would ever dare raise his name again. They brought him to the Roman governor's house, and Pilate came out and said, what are you doing here? And they tried to just get past the gatekeeper by saying, if this man wasn't guilty, do you think we'd be here? And he said, no. What has he done? They said, well, you know, he says he's a king, and he tells people not to pay money to Caesar, and he's committed the crime of blasphemy. And Pilate, the Roman governor, couldn't care less. He looked at him and said, take him and try him according to your own courts. I don't care about this stuff. And they looked at Pilate and they said, we have a law that he should die, but it's not legal for us to put him to death, which wasn't exactly true. They had their own certain conditions under which they could put somebody to death, but it wasn't the kind of execution they were looking for. They needed him to be a complete outcast from God and outcast from his people. And so Pilate brought Jesus in and asked him what was going on and what the people had accused him of. And Pilate went out and told them, I find nothing in this man worthy of death. In fact, they had a conversation, or Pilate had a conversation with Jesus and with the Jews, and they said, if you don't execute him, you are no friend of Caesar. And we know the story that Pilate simply washed his hands and said, I am not guilty of the blood of this man. The man who signed Jesus' execution papers gave a public testimony that Jesus was not guilty of anything that he could discover. Church, Jesus endured injustice. Now, it's true that our land and our lives are filled with injustice, but nothing quite to the level of what Jesus endured, and he endured it for us. What can you do when nobody believes the truth? What can you do when you're falsely accused? What can you do when there is no higher court that you can take your case to? He stood before the Roman governor, and John tells us what Jesus was up against. Pilate entered his headquarters again. This is John 19. He called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So, you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" Church, there it is. That's what Jesus was up against. When a person who has your life in their hands has no concern for the actual truth, we have a hopeless case. We know, of course, that God had ordained all of this, and it was all part of his plan for Jesus to take our place. But I'm talking to you today, reminding you that when you face injustice, when no one will hear your case, when no one will believe the truth, Jesus went there first. He endured injustice so that he could go to the cross and take justice, the punishment our sins deserved, so that we might receive mercy.